Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to talk about DisAdd Dan, which is the tool we're going to use to talk about what a DisAdd is, what the components are, and then we're going to hopefully go through and talk about some advanced tips and tricks for how to use different arguments on a DisAdd, maybe in ways that you all have not thought about before. So for DisAdd Dan, I'm not sure how many of us have done this before, but kind of the quintessential teaching tool that you might have heard of is that we have a person sitting on this cliff, and this person's name is Dan. And Dan is chilling out on the cliff. Everything's going well for Dan. Give him a little face. There you go. There's Dan, and he's chilling on this cliff, and he's doing okay, but he's on the edge of the cliff, and down below the cliff is a fiery pit of doom that we don't want to fall into, or else we fall to our death. Okay. Now, this is the story of Dan. Dan is looking over the cliff. Dan is having a good time, and everything seems to be going okay. Now, the fact that Dan is doing okay and that everything is going okay is the concept that we call uniqueness. Uniqueness. It is the state of the world now. Okay, so Dan is doing okay. He's chilling out on the cliff. And then there is this bad thing that happens at the bottom that we sometimes refer to as the impact. The impact is what happens that we're trying to avoid. Now, what DisAdds tend to say is the following. Dan is chilling on the cliff. Everything is going okay. But the plan would push Dan off of the cliff. So let's say we're like, our plan is that, Brian should push Dan off the cliff. Now, if Brian pushes Dan off the cliff, what's going to happen to Dan? If I push Dan off the cliff, what do we think is going to happen to Dan?
He's probably going to die.
He's going to fall, and then he's going to go to his doom. So Dan is here. That's uniqueness. The link is that the plan pushes Dan off the cliff. The impact is that Dan falls to his death. Sometimes when we talk about DisAdd Dan, we have more steps than that. And we can kind of break things into sub-steps, which might be useful. So maybe like a sub-step is that if Dan gets pushed off the cliff because of gravity, he'll be pulled down. Maybe it's like if you push him a little bit, then there's like a little tiny rock over here that Dan's going to trip over. And if he trips over this rock, then he's going to like fall to his doom. So like maybe I'm not pushing him that hard, but my pushing him causes him to fall to his doom. Make sense? Now, there can be as many interim steps in DisAdd Dan as you want, okay? So like, in theory, my DisAdd could say that like, I don't know, I am chilling over here, and I'm gonna send a rocket up into the sky. And if I send a rocket up, it will make really cool fireworks that Dan will look at. And if Dan looks at the really cool fireworks, then maybe that will cause Dan to not notice this little pebble on the ground. And maybe if Dan doesn't notice that little pebble on the ground, then he'll trip and fall, and then he'll go to his doom, okay? All of those little side steps that we're talking about are often referred to as internal links. They're referred to as internal links. It's all of the steps that it takes to get from part A to part B. And there can be as many or as few internal links as you want. So just to kind of think about that. A link is what the plan does. An internal link is anything that is caused by the link that isn't yet the impact. The impact is the ultimate bad thing we care about. Okay, so, it's possible that sometimes the distinction between these parts of the debate can be a little iffy. So like sometimes you're like, is that an internal link, or is that a link, or is that part of the impact? So if you're like Dan falls and then like he breaks his arm, like is him breaking his arm the impact, or is that an internal link to another impact? That's kind of up to how you debate it. But in concept, the important distinction here is the link is the thing that is caused by the plan. So the link is the idea that I'm going to push Dan, The link is the idea that there's someone over here saying, hey, Dan, I know that you're really close to this link, but we're pushing you. And that is exactly what is causing Dan to fall. Does that make sense? So we use link. This term describes something that the plan does. This term describes something that the plan does. Does that check out to everyone? Cool. So we have our basic concept of a disad, which is, you have uniqueness. What is the state of the world now? You have link. What does the plan do to affect that? You have maybe internal links, which are the things that happen after the plan. And then you have the terminal impacts. Some of these concepts may be more or less confusing. Usually the one that is the most confusing to people is the concept of uniqueness. So I want to go over that for a little bit together. So uniqueness exists as such. Uniqueness is the question of where Dan is on the cliff. And that might matter for a variety of reasons. So let's start with the idea, if Dan were already off the cliff, okay? So Dan were chilling off of the cliff over this pit of doom that sits underneath him, right? So that's where Dan is. What is going to happen right now if Dan is over the cliff? Whether or not the plan does something. What is the invariable result of Dan hanging off of a cliff?
He's going to fall.
He's going to fall. Now, this is what we call a non-unique argument. This means that the disad is non-unique, means that it will happen right now. And I'm sure I spelled something wrong. Yeah. Now, there is the possibility, alternatively, that maybe Dan isn't off the cliff, but he's really, 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 really close to the edge of the cliff. He's standing right on the cliff, being like, hey, look, no hands. Like, I'm so close to falling off, but I'm not falling off. Now, if Dan is really close to being off the cliff, does that mean that he's going to die right now? No. It means that the disad is unique if close to the edge of the cliff or on safe land. Now, the concept of how close or far Dan is to the cliff is usually related to the concept of brink, which is just a fancy way of saying at what point will Dan be off the cliff. In order to show this, the negative generally on a disad wants to say that Dan is very close to falling off of the edge so that they can say that the plan pushes him off the edge. Because I want to look at a slightly different example. Imagine that Dan is way over here, okay? And I push Dan as hard as I can and as far as I can, but all I can do is move him this far, okay? Now, in this instance, we're going to run up against an issue, which is that if I push Dan as hard as I can, he's just going to move from where he is. Oh no, I lost his arms. He's just going to move from where he is to over here. And that isn't going to trigger our impact, right? Because if Dan is just chilling over here, what happens? Is he safe or is he dying?
He's safe.
He's safe. Now, this is the concept that is used in two different ways. One way we could talk about this is we could say the term uniqueness overwhelms the link. In other words, what that means is that Dan is so safe that even pushing him won't cause him to fall, okay? So one is that if Dan is way too safe, that could mean that there are uniqueness issues with the DA. Now, another way to think about this is that this could mean that the link isn't strong enough. So this could be a question of what I like to call link magnitude. Okay. So importantly, and this is a really tricky concept for a disad, you want Dan to be as safe as he can be while simultaneously assuring that the plan is going to be strong enough to push disad Dan off the cliff, right? Now, this is a tricky concept. That means that if your link argument is really not that good, if your link argument is like, and then a gust of wind blows Dan, Dan needs to be very, very, very close to the edge of the cliff, but not off it. And there needs to be nothing else that's going to push him besides that gust of wind. if your link argument is really, really strong, then it might be that you want to say that Dan is more safe at the moment. Does that make sense? So if your link argument is strong, Dan can be relatively safe now. If your link argument is very bad and your link argument is weak, or your link doesn't have strong magnitude, it doesn't push very aggressively, then it follows that Dan has to be relatively in danger of falling. So even small things could push him off the brick. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so these are all questions of uniqueness in terms of where is Dan now? But I would like to kind of add in a dilemma that could be existing. What if I told you that Dan was currently really safe, but Dan is running off the cliff? So maybe if you've been in a physics class, you would think of the concept of momentum, that like Dan is currently moving in a direction. Or we could even change from talking about Dan to talking about like a ball that is currently on a slope, right? So instead of Dan as a person, we just have a little ball that's chilling on this slope. And what's going to happen if you have a ball on a slope? What's it inevitably going to do?
It's inevitably gonna fall down and roll down.
Right, because the ball has momentum. That means that it's going to roll down the hill. So let me kind of get that picture looking for us. Right, so if you have a ball like this, it's going to roll down that hill whether or not it is pushed. Does that make sense? Now, this is a way of thinking about uniqueness in a slightly different way. This means that uniqueness doesn't necessarily have to be what is occurring now, but uniqueness as what is going to occur. Some people also think about this in terms of the concept of link uniqueness. So what do I mean when I say link uniqueness? Is it might be true that Dan is currently safe on the cliff, but something will inevitably push Dan off the cliff. Now, another example that might exist here, if we were to go back to thinking about disadd Dan as being a person, is you could be like, if I push disadd Dan, he will fall off the cliff, right? But what if I said someone else is going to push disadd Dan now? There's another person that's going to push Dan. What does that mean? What implication would it have for our disadd if another person is likely going to push Dan now besides me?
It doesn't matter what the plan does because something else is already gonna shove him into the
Right.
pit.
Right. Something else is going to shove Dan into the pit. Now, in politics and other debates, you might have heard a word for this that some people use called thumper. Thumper is just a way of saying that the link is not unique, or something will trigger the link now. Importantly, these are not arguments that say Dan is currently off the cliff, but arguments that say that the thing that would push Dan off the cliff is already likely to occur. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay, one other concept that I would like to display here is that every argument, according to this schema, has uniqueness. So if I said, if you push Dan, then Dan will fall off the cliff, you could also say, well, maybe Dan will be tripped now. Maybe Dan is going to trip because Dan is really clumsy. That means that he's going to fall inevitably. Or maybe you could say that Dan has some terminal disease, so Dan is going to die inevitably, whether or not he falls off the cliff. Okay, this introduces a concept that all arguments have uniqueness. You have to win that your link won't happen now, that your internal link won't happen now, and that your impact won't happen now. If the ath can win that any of those things will currently occur, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble, because it means that Dan is already going to die from one of the proximate causes that we're talking about. So maybe we aren't super concerned about what's happening with Dan, about if the plan pushes Dan off the cliff, if Dan is going to die or something bad is going to happen to Dan anyway. Does this check out to a certain degree? Okay. One concern that is related to this is that means if your DA has more internal links, you might have more UQ questions to answer, right? Because you need to win not only that your disad as a whole has uniqueness, AKA that Dan is safe on the cliff, but also that nothing will push him, also that he won't trip, also that he's not going to be pulled down by gravity, also that he's not going to die. If I make that internal link chain even longer, so maybe I'm like, well, I'm going to go hang out with Dan later. And if I don't hang out with Dan, then Dan's going to go hang out on a cliff. And if Dan goes and hangs out on a cliff, then he's going to fall. And if he falls, then he's going to break his arm. And if he breaks his arm, then he's going to have to spend money at the hospital. And if he spends money at the hospital, then he's not going to have money for dinner, and then he's going to die. If I make that internal link chain really long and drawn out, there are lots of places where the affirmative could point out that I have uniqueness issues. Does that make sense? So one thing that this observes, if I'm affirmative, if AF, question uniqueness at every part of the DA. If neg, hope my DA doesn't have a million internal links, or write a DA around the concept that as we add in these internal links, we're going to have uniqueness questions for every single one of them. Make sense? Okay. This is the concept of uniqueness. I know that we spent, I don't know, like a third of our time already talking about this, but it's because this is probably the most confusing argument that we have about disad Dan. I'm going to clear the board and we're going to move on to the next part about disad Dan. So, why is this not clearing? Okay, so after dealing with uniqueness, we have figured out that Dan is safely on the cliff and he is kind of close to the edge, right? So that our link will be strong enough to push Dan over the cliff. Now, the link is the direction that something moves Dan. The link is the direction that something moves Dan. Link is direction something moves Dan. Now, links can occur multiple ways, right? You could say that Dan is pushed off the cliff. But similarly, someone could argue that something pushes Dan in the other direction, back onto the cliff, okay? So in theory, you could push Dan in either direction at any point in time. The distinction between these is the distinction between what we call a link and a link turn. These both agree that the plan moves Dan, but they disagree about the direction. So a link turn says that instead of pushing Dan off the cliff, we actually push Dan back onto the cliff. So we make it so that Dan is going to be net more safe. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, similarly to me saying that links have magnitude, which is another way of saying how much does the link matter, or how strong is the push, link turns also have magnitude. And one important question that is often overlooked is that the AF and neg need to compare the strength / magnitude of the link to the link turn. So let's say that my link is like, if I push Dan, Dan will intuitively try to move backwards in order to stay safe. That could be a link turn that says that the plan will cause Dan to go further onto the cliff. But one question might be, will Dan move to safety more, or will he get moved further by my push off of the cliff? Does that make sense? So both things could happen simultaneously, and you need to compare what is more important, the way that the link works or the way that the link turn works. Similarly, other arguments that you might have used when comparing impacts also apply. So links and link turns also have time frame. What do I mean by that? Let's say that I say, if I push Dan, Dan will fall off of the cliff right now. But, you know, if I push Dan, then maybe someone will call the ambulance, and the ambulance will show up, and the ambulance will take Dan to a hospital, which is in the opposite direction of being off the cliff. Well, while that link turn is great and all, that link turn is occurring way after the original link. So Dan would already fall to his death before the ambulance shows up and moves him in the other direction, right? Now, one common takeaway from this that I think is often overlooked is that sometimes the link occurs before the link turn and triggers the impact before the link turn. So maybe by the time the link turn happens, it's too late to be relevant. The primary example where this tends to occur is on the politics DA. And the example that I'm thinking of is an argument that you all might have heard called winners win, which is the argument that's like, if the president can show that they can get something controversial done, then everyone will think that they're like super cool and super awesome, and people will fall behind the president because they know that the president has the ability to do stuff. Now, here's the issue with that argument. While that might be a good link turn insofar as it says that the plan moves Dan in the opposite direction, that link turn may occur days, months, or years after the original fight link. So it might not be sufficient to stop the impact from occurring. That makes some sense. I know I used a lot of debate words back to back there, but what I'm saying is that the link can have an immediate effect sometimes, which is that the plan immediately causes Dan to freak out, or in the terms of the politics DSAD, it immediately causes a huge fight. But the link turn might not occur until long after that fight, which means that the agenda item the AF is talking about might, or the neg is talking about, might already be blocked from passage. Or if we use our DSAD Dan picture, it's like the neg might move Dan back onto the cliff, but after he's already fallen down here, and then moving him back to the left isn't possible because there's a brick wall right there in his way, right? Like if Dan's right here and you move him to the left, that's not going to do anything. Is this checking out or not really? Okay, Zoe's the only person with a camera on and is nodding yes. So I'm taking that as we understand the concept that links have magnitude and they have time frame. The last impact comparison argument that you all are probably used to making is the concept of probability. That's like how likely is something to occur. You could similarly say that the link or link turn is not very likely to occur, but I'm guessing that that's already the way that we think about addressing these things. Okay, the next thing that I want to talk about is the intersection or the crossover between links and uniqueness arguments. The intersection between links and uniqueness arguments. So we've talked a little bit about the concept that links and link turns require some degree of uniqueness, and that where Dan is might affect how good your link or link turn is. But one thing that I want to address is that in order to win a link argument, as offense, you need to win Dan is safe. So if we imagine the following scenario where Dan is currently off the cliff, the plan pushes Dan off the cliff. If Dan is off the cliff, he falls to his doom. And I know we talked about this earlier. What is the issue with this as a DSAD? Dan is currently off the cliff. The plan pushes Dan off the cliff. If Dan is off the cliff, he falls to his doom. Zoe?
They're not exclusively doing anything to cause Dan to die.
Right. Dan is already off the cliff, so it doesn't matter how much or how little you continue to push him in that direction. It just doesn't make a difference. Now, this is a fundamental uniqueness issue. The same thing occurs when we talk about the concept of link turns. So a link turn would be the concept that you push Dan onto the cliff. Now, a link turn is offense if Dan is currently off the cliff. And that's because if Dan is falling to his doom and you push him onto his cliff and stop him from dying, that means that you do a good thing and Dan will be safe, right? But if Dan is currently safe, Dan's chilling over here. Oh, goodness. I don't know what I just did. If Dan's chilling over here and you push him further onto the cliff, That doesn't really matter. Dan goes from being safe to being more safe. In that instance, the link turn is solely acting as a defensive argument. Link turn is defense if Dan is already safe. Does that make sense to people? It's not an offensive argument because you don't help Dan anymore. You just move him from being safe to being slightly safer. Does that check out? It's also worth noting that just like when we talked about uniqueness for links, link turns have some of the same issues. So a link turn could be something that is already triggered now, or your link turn might not have uniqueness. So, if your link turn is like, Dan is currently asleep, if I touch him, it will wake him up. It could be like, and that will get him to come back onto the cliff. It could be like, well, it's already going to rain, which is waking him up. There could be something else that is triggering the link turn current. Okay. Similarly, your link turn might not match the magnitude of your non-unique. So if you're like, Dan is 100 miles off the cliff and I push him 2 inches back toward the cliff, that's just not going to get it done to save Dan. So you can question whether or not these link turns fit together. Another kind of classic example of this in the politics dissad, I don't know why, but it seems like an easy one to talk about, is you could be like, a bill won't pass now because people are so partisan against it. So like the infrastructure won't pass because Republicans are very partisan about the concept of spending money. And then you could be like, link turn, the plan is popular. Unfortunately, that link turn does not resolve the reasons that the bill is off the cliff now. Okay, so if you're neg, you might want to question whether or not the link turns fit with the non-unique arguments that the app has put forward. Okay, one last concept that I want to talk about with the link turn. Is we've looked right now at a disadvantage where that has been link turned. Dan is off the cliff. The plan pushes Dan onto the cliff. If Dan falls off of the cliff, he dies. If I didn't want to talk about this in terms of a disadvantage, does anyone know what else contains this structure of thing? Something that is almost identical to a disad, but a disad that is read the opposite way. What would we call that? What?
An advantage on the F.
Right. Disad Dan, if disad Dan is only non-unique and link turned, that is the same thing as an advantage. Okay. So the structure of an advantage and the structure of a disadvantage are very, very, very similar. That might mean that a lot of the things we're saying here are applicable to how you think about answering advantages. Just kind of like food for thought while we're doing this. Does that make sense to people? Amazing. Okay. The next part of a disad that we want to talk about is the internal link. So the internal link says that once Dan falls off the cliff, what is going to happen to Dan? So in this instance, our internal link is like gravity will push Dan down and then he'll fall into this thing and die. But it's possible that you could have either defensive or turn arguments to the internal link. So you could say something like, Dan has a jetpack and actually he'll go up and then he'll be safe. Or maybe like this is taking place on a different planet where gravity doesn't exist, right? So just like the link, you can question the logic of the internal link or the causation that it may imply. Does that make sense to people? And like we said earlier, there can be near infinite internal links that are read. So you could say, if you push Dan, he trips. Well, you could answer that with like, actually, Dan is really smooth and he's not going to trip. He's not clumsy at all. Or like, if you push Dan, he'll trip and then he'll fall off the cliff. You could be like, maybe Dan can grab onto the side of the cliff. Or maybe for some reason, gravity doesn't work, so Dan won't fall. This all check out? Okay. One important thing is that you could say that Dan going up is actually beneficial for some reason. You could be like, there is a reason that our internal link defense argument is good. So like if Dan goes up, if Dan is pushed off the cliff because gravity is backwards, he goes up and that makes him happy. This would be a turn. This would be an offensive argument about why it's good to push Dan off the cliff. Now, one thing that we really want to avoid is we don't want to make multiple types of turns in the 2AC. By which I mean, if it is good to push Dan off the cliff because he'll go up or for some other reason, then we don't want to say that the plan stops Dan from getting pushed off the cliff. Why is that the case? Zoe, you have a hand up.
Because then you stop a good thing from happening.
Right. So if Dan is off the cliff and being off the cliff causes him to go up into the sky, which makes him super happy, and the plan puts him back on the cliff, then we're being bad by doing that. So we want to watch out in the 2AC that we don't make multiple types of turns. The thing that Zoe described is called a double turn, which is where you link turn plus internal link or impact. And you want to be really careful if you're reading multiple types of arguments that have the word turn in them. Sometimes it's possible that your turns don't interact with each other, but I would always be very hesitant to do anything like that because you don't want to cause yourself trouble. Does this check out to everyone? Okay. Really quickly, I do want to go over, since we just introduced the concept of a double turn. If you double turn, if there is a double turn, what should the negative team do? If there is a double turn, what does the negative team do? So the negative team needs to do a few things. First, they need to concede the double turn arguments. Concede Dan is off the cliff. Concede the plan moves Dan onto the cliff. Concede Dan being off the cliff is good. Is that all you do if you're conceding a double turn? If the other team double turns themselves, what do you have to do after you concede all of these things? Do people have ideas?
I'm actually not sure. Maybe like they say like the plan causes something bad or something good to not happen.
So if you have done this, first you concede their arguments. Two, you need to answer any arguments they have that take out the double turn. So maybe they say they also have a no link or no internal link argument that's like Dan is unmovable. Or maybe they have a no impact argument that's like, we shouldn't care about Dan. Dan sucks. So you need to answer any arguments that might respond to the double turn, because functionally all you're doing is saying they have read a disad to themselves. So you need to make sure to respond to anything they have. And third, and this is a very important thing that is almost always messed up, you still need a reason why the double turn outweighs the case. So you need to do impact comparison. You need to do impact comparison. You need to do impact comparison. This is a really weird story, but 2 years ago, I was coaching a team that double turned themselves in college in the quarterfinals of a national debate tournament. And the other team was like, we will concede the double turn. And then our team proceeded to win the debate on our case outweighs the double turn, because the other team never explained why the double turn mattered. And multiple judges were like, it doesn't matter if it's a double turn because the case outweighs. So you need to make sure, if you want to go for an offensive argument, that you do impact comparison. The other team doesn't automatically lose, and it's not like you stand up and you're like, okay, debate over, see ya, bye. Make sense? Okay, one other tricky thing about the concept of a double turn. If we were to say Dan falling off the cliff is good because it pushes him up, and also the plan pushes Dan further away from the cliff, is this a double turn? So the 1NC is like, Dan is on the cliff, the plan pushes him off, that makes him fall, that's bad. The 2AC is like, actually, we push Dan up, or actually we push Dan away from the cliff, and if Dan falls, he goes up. Is this a double turn? Zoe.
The uniqueness was never contested, so I don't think so.
Okay, correct. This is not necessarily a double turn because Dan is currently on the cliff. So one important thing, if link turns need uniqueness, it also follows that for something to be a double turn, you must have a uniqueness argument that fits with the link. I think this is a really confusing concept, but technically, you have not double turned yourself if you have not said non-unique. Now, when I go around reading link turns and internal link turns or link turns and impact turns and being like, haha, joke's on you, we didn't mess with uniqueness, it's a scary proposition. It's possible that you could do such a thing, but you're being very risky. So I'm not sure if I would recommend it. Does that make sense to people? Okay. The last component of disadd Dan that we want to talk about is the impact. So let me remove some of the stuff from here. Delete. Okay. The impact for disadd Dan is what happens if Dan falls into this pit. Now, there are a few ways that you could respond to the impact argument. We've talked about the concept of impact uniqueness already, but you could also read what's called impact defense, which is just to say that the impact doesn't matter. So you could be like, the pit is actually not that bad. Or maybe like, fine, Dan will die, but we don't care about Dan. Or maybe something else like that. You could also have what's called impact turns. Now, again, this has that word turn. So it means that it's going to be an offensive argument. And an impact turn says, it is good if Dan falls into the pit. So you could say that's because the pit gives Dan magical powers, or maybe it could be because we don't like Dan. Importantly, these two impact turns are impact turns for reasons that do not fit together, and you could read two impact turns that get yourself into a double turn-esque situation. So we should be careful about that as well. Does that make sense? Now, if I were to read an impact turn that was like, it's good if Dan falls into the pit because Dan will gain magical powers, it is important that we need to have defense to the other team's impact and say it won't kill Dan. Importantly, if we have impact turn, Dan falling into the pit, good, we need defense that Dan falling into the pit doesn't cause extinction or doesn't kill him, right? Because if it kills him and then grants him magical powers, it really doesn't matter that he has magical powers because he's dead. Yeah. There are different ways we could do this. Just like what we talked about with the link turn, we could talk about the magnitude of the fall on him. Maybe it will break his arm and grant him magical powers. We could talk about the probability of if he will be harmed by falling into the pit, or we could talk about the time frame. Maybe he'll get the magical powers before it tries to kill him and the magical powers will protect him, right? So we need to talk about how we think our impact turn interacts with the impact. Ryan, do you have a question about that?
Yeah, I just wondered, what would like that be an example of in like the politics disadd? Like, what would that look like without the analogy of like Dan?
Okay, so let's take here. I'll give you an example. This is a little bit old, but this is from when I was debating. We debated another team that said we should stop drone strikes because drone strikes cause Yemeni instability, and Yemeni instability will cause global terrorism and extinction. Okay. We said Yemeni instability was really important for US-Saudi relations, and also Yemeni instability would not cause terrorism. Now, importantly, we need defense to their claim that Yemeni instability is bad, in addition to our offensive argument that Yemeni instability is good for relations. If we had just said Yemeni instability is good for relations, they would say, sure, but it also causes extinction. Do you see what I'm saying? So like another example that you all might have seen is if you want to go for like growth is bad, DDI, you're like growth is bad because it causes warming, which causes extinction. Okay, but it could also be true that a collapse of economic growth causes extinction through nuclear war. So if you don't have relevant defense that matches with your offense, you're in a lot of trouble.
Because they could just say like, actually, if you didn't put any defense on it, they could be like, oh, actually, the impact just outweighs the impact turn. Like it's equally as bad.
Correct. That's exactly the point. And, to make this even more confusing, that concept that we were talking about of time frame is also important, because you could say that, look, our economic collapse causes extinction before warming does, so our thing matters more. Okay. Do people have questions about that? One kind of aside about this, since we're already talking here, because of the concept that you need impact defense that fits with your impact turn, one way that you could think about impact turns is they might be very strategic when defense to the other team's impact is very easy to read, and not strategic when that defense is bad. So for example, in the example I was giving earlier, the reason that Yemen impact turn ended up being very strategic was because it's not as if the other team was going to beat us on the argument that Yemeni instability caused extinction. That claim is very bad. So because our defense was relatively good, that instability doesn't cause extinction, we felt comfortable making offensive arguments there, even though our argument was pretty silly. Okay. Now, there are two more concepts that I want to make sure that we cover today. So we're going to move on from this to the concepts of turns case and solves case. And these are slightly different arguments, but DA turns case and DA solves case. Okay. DA turns the case would be the following. Let's say that the affirmative has read an advantage. That's like, Dan barely knows I exist, and he doesn't pay any attention to me. And if I push Dan, he'll pay attention to me. Okay? That's the ass advantage. And the neg is like, here's the thing, buddy. If you push Dan, he's going to fall off the cliff and then die. And if Dan falls off the cliff and is dead, Dan cannot pay attention to you. So if Dan is dead, he cannot pay attention to you. That argument would say that the impact to the DA turns the case. The impact to the DA then turns the case. Does that make sense? So the impact, and this is just a fancy way of saying the impact to the DA means that the case is wrong. Now, it's even better if you can make turns case arguments earlier up in the chain. So maybe you could say link turns case, pushing Dan makes him hate you. Or internal link turns case, if Dan trips/falls, he will forget what happened and not remember you. Or impact turns case, if Dan dies, he can't like you. Now, two important things. One is that you can make multiple turns case arguments in the same speech. You can have multiple different turns case arguments in the same 2AC or in the same 2NC. And that can be useful because it means you can guarantee that you turn the case on a variety of levels. Two is that the higher up on the chain a turns case argument is, the better it is. Now, I know that that's a little confusing, so I want to draw a quick diagram that will hopefully explain this. So most DAs work like this. There are a chain of events that one causes the next, causes the next, causes the next, and so on and so forth, right? And that's why we use the language of a link chain, because it looks like a link, like a chain link fence. This is the same idea. So if you say that our last thing on the chain, like this thing all the way over here, turns the case, that assumes that you have won all of the arguments before, right? That assumes that you've won all of these arguments. But realistically, the further down the chain you get, the less likely something is, because it means that you have to have won everything before. Does that make sense? So in order to win this, if we think about these as here, we think of these as A, B, C, D, E. In order to win E, it must be true that A through D are true. In order to win A, only A has to be true. So the first thing in the link chain is necessarily more probable than the last thing in the link chain. Necessarily, because you would multiply the probabilities together in order to figure out how probable the last thing in the chain is. That means that you want to turn the case as early in the chain as possible. So it's very preferable, if possible, to say A turns the case, then E turns the case, right? Now, this goes with a few corollary comments. If our impact to thing E is that something causes extinction, it is not even useful to say extinction turns the case, because extinction is the ultimate bad thing that we are talking about, right? So imagine that we're having a debate where we're like, our advantage is about agriculture, and the negative is like, we're going for the politics disad that says the plan causes economic collapse. A 2NC that's like, economic collapse turns the case because we can't have agriculture if we're all dead is not super useful, because if you win that we all die, you're going to win anyway. So you want to turn the case somewhere before you would win the debate if you got there anyway. Does that make sense? So it would be better if you could make arguments that were like, fights in Congress cause uncertainty, which turns the case, rather than extinction turns the case. Ryan, you seem confused about that.
Yeah, just like a little bit. So are you saying that like in the disad we should just like as soon as possible we turn the case, like we start, like you try to start with like the link or something, like I'm not sure if that.
Two things. One is that as soon as you can turn the case, you should. So if you can say the link turns the case, the internal link turns the case, etc., you should do that. That is much more likely that you're going to get there than it is to the terminal impact. Two, you should ask yourself the following question. If I already won that this thing would occur, would I win the debate? So if I already won that the plan causes a nuclear war, am I going to win the debate? If the answer to that is yes, there is no reason to say nuclear war turns the case, because you're already going to win if the plan causes nuclear war. So it's kind of an asinine argument to even make. It's just using your time in a way that doesn't make sense. Does that make sense?
Right. So it's like if you like win that, like the disad leads to like extinction, there's no need, because like it leads to extinction.
Right.
Not
So
really.
saying extinction turns the case is a little silly. I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but just like it rarely makes much sense to say. Okay.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah.
Now I want to get to a quite confusing concept. So let's imagine the following thing. The app has read an advantage that says agriculture is collapsing now. So let me draw this up. It says agriculture is collapsing now. That will cause extinction. The plan solves, right? So they have their little advantage drawing that looks something like this. And then they have whatever. I'm just going to make a simple version of Dan because it will make this go faster. They have Dan right here. They're like, you know, Dan is going to fall off the cliff now. We save Dan, causes extinction. Now, when you make a disad turns case argument, the argument you're making is that the plan actually pushes Dan in the opposite direction, right? So the negative is saying that the plan pushes Dan this way because it stops this bill from passing, and if this bill doesn't pass, it will hurt agriculture. Now, has the negative made an offensive argument about why it hurts agriculture based on this drawing? So the advantage says agriculture is failing, we make agriculture good, agriculture failure causes extinction. And the neg says, but the DA turns the case, so the plan hurts agriculture more. Is that going to be offense for the negative?
Yeah. Right.
Ryan thinks yeah. The other people think something?
I don't think so.
Why not, Zoe?
I'm not exactly sure, but it just seems a little suspect.
Okay. So it seems suspect, but then it has the word turn, so it seems like yes. So I want to think about it if we're only talking about their agriculture advantage. So their agriculture advantage says failing now, which means right now, ag is falling off the cliff and causing extinction. The plan solves. And the neg said, actually, you make agriculture worse. What is the negative missing in order to have offense here? So what argument do they have? Sorry, Iris, can you say that one more time? I didn't hear you.
They need a uniqueness argument?
Correct. They need a uniqueness argument. The issue is that, and this is a really weird thing to say, turns case isn't unique. It's already happening that agriculture is failing. So whether or not the plan hurts agriculture, it is failing now. And furthermore, the AF could say ag failing now equals extinction. Plan solves. Then they could say the DA might turn the case, but that isn't unique. And then ultimately get to the most annoying AF argument of all time, which is that means it's try or die AF because we have extinction 100% if you vote neg. In other words, they could say, you're certain if you don't vote for us that we're all going to die because ag is already off the cliff. Dan is already off the cliff. Only voting for the plan has a chance of putting Dan back on the cliff. Even if we could hurt agriculture, it doesn't matter because agriculture is already failing. Okay, does that trick make some sense to people? And this is going to bring us to the last argument that I want to talk about, which is also one of the few reasons why I think the politics DA is good, despite my general disdain for the politics DA. The politics DA has the following trick. It can say, hey, look, Biden is going to pass this infrastructure bill now. And if Biden passes this infrastructure bill, it means that agriculture will be saved now. Now, this might sound similar to the argument that we were making earlier, but it's very different because this argument is not that the DA turns the case, but that the DA solves the case. Or in other words, right now, there is something that will push Dan back on the cliff. And what did we call that when we talked about it with DAs? Or when we talked about it with link turns? This was what we called a link uniqueness argument. So the reason that the politics disad can be so tricky in particular is because you can say that not only is it that you stop a good thing from happening, oh goodness, I lost the screen. Not only is it that you stop a good thing from happening, that good thing will currently resolve the entirety of the case, which obviates the argument that our turns case arguments are non-unique, because you're going to say that uniqueness will fundamentally change because a bill is going to pass. Okay, I just want to review a few of the kind of advanced concepts that we went over really quickly, so that when your lab leader is like, what did you learn? What was different about this lecture than what we already learned about stuff? One, all arguments have uniqueness. Two, all arguments have time frame, probability, and magnitude. Three, you can turn the case at different levels of the DA. Turning it earlier is better. 4, solves the case versus turns the case. Those are the advanced concepts that we went over. Yeah. And then we also went over the kind of basic concepts of disad, Dan, basics. Check out. Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording and then we can ask any questions that you all might have. So give me a second to figure out how to do that.